For 15 years, I was the most important ingredient in my husband's life, and also the most invisible. To the world, Julian Croft was a culinary god, an alchemist who could transform simple ingredients into Michelin-starred poetry. His restaurant, Aura, was a temple of modern gastronomy, a place where reservations were whispered about like state secrets, and a single tasting menu cost more than my first car. He was a celebrity, his handsome face gracing the covers of food magazines, his voice a charming, authoritative baritone on countless television shows. He was a genius. He was a visionary. He was a lie. And I was the ghostwriter of his entire brilliant career. Our story began not in a gleaming stainless steel kitchen, but in a tiny, steam-filled trattoria in a forgotten corner of Tuscany. I was a young art student, spending a year abroad trying to find myself in Renaissance paintings. He was a line cook with a ferocious ambition and a charm that could coax the secrets out of old Italian nonas. I fell in love with his passion. He, I later realized, fell in love with my palate, not my palate, was a strange, intuitive thing, a gift passed down from my grandmother. I didn't just taste food. I understood it. I could deconstruct a sauce with a single spoonful, identify the missing note of acidity, the subtle hint of a spice that was needed to elevate it from merely good to sublime. My grandmother had called it the tongue that remembers. I could taste a dish and see its potential, its perfect, idealized form. I was a muse, not of art, but a flavor dot in those early heady days of love and pasta. I shared my gift with him. Freely, I would taste his sauces and suggest a pinch of smoked paprika. I would refine his pastry recipes, explaining the delicate chemistry of fat and flour. I was his secret collaborator, his silent partner. We were a team. When he proposed with a ring he'd bought by selling his grandfather's watch, he whispered, "You and me, Elena, we're going to build an empire of flavor." I believed him. We moved back to New York, armed with his ambition and my grandmother's leather-bound recipe book, a tome filled with generations of culinary secrets. We opened our first small restaurant in the East Village with a loan I secured against my small inheritance. I worked alongside him, not on the line, but in the prep kitchen in the quiet hours before service, refining, tasting, creating. The dishes that made him famous, the ones that earned him his first glowing review, the slow-braised lamb with lavender and honey, the saffron risotto with bone marrow, they were all born from the pages of my grandmother's book, filtered through my palate and executed by his skilled hands. But as his star began to rise, my presence began to fade. "It's better for the brand, darling," he explained one evening, after a journalist had asked too many questions about my role in the kitchen. "The world loves the idea of the lone genius, the solitary artist. It's a more compelling story." And so I agreed. I retreated from the kitchen, from the public eye, and became the supportive wife, the woman behind the man. My contributions became a secret, a private ritual. He would bring home new dishes from the restaurant, and I would taste them, my suggestions, whispered in the privacy of our home, to be implemented the next day by his team. He was the architect. I was the silent, uncredited structural engineer who made sure his beautiful creations didn't collapse. For a while, it was enough. I loved him, and I was proud of the empire we were building, even if my name was nowhere on the blueprint. We had 2 beautiful children, a sprawling townhouse, a life that was, from the outside, a perfect picture of success and happiness. But success changed him. The passionate young cook I had fallen in love with was slowly replaced by a preemie, arrogant celebrity. He began to believe his own press. The lone genius narrative was no longer a marketing strategy. It was his religion. He started to resent my contributions, to see my palate not as a gift, but as a critique. Our tasting sessions became tense, my suggestions met with a defensive glare. "It's my restaurant, Elena," he would stamp, my name on the door. "Let's not. Forget that." He started to subtly, systematically erase me from our own history. In interviews, he would tell a romantic, fabricated story of how he had discovered the secret of the lavender braised lamb while wandering through the hills of Provence. He took the stories of my grandmother, of my childhood, and he claimed them as his own. He was not just stealing my recipes. He was stealing my life. The final, most brutal erasure came with his cookbook. Aura, a culinary philosophy, was a masterpiece, a 300-page monument to his genius. It was filled with stunning photographs, poetic essays on the nature of flavor, and the recipes that had made him a star. My recipes, my grandmother's recipes. My name was not mentioned once, not even in the acknowledgments. When I confronted him, my voice shaking with a hurt so profound it was almost physical, he looked at me with a cool, dismissive pity. "Oh, Elena, don't be so sentimental," he said, flipping through a glossy page. "You're a wonderful home cook." Amused, but this is the big league. This is about brand building. And the brand is Julian Croft. It's what sells. That was the night the love finally irrevocably died. I was left with a cold, hollowed-out marriage and the bitter taste of my own stolen legacy. I stayed for the children, for the life I had helped build. I retreated further into the role of the quiet, supportive wife, but my silence was no longer born of love. It was the silence of a prisoner, a ghost haunting the beautiful, empty rooms of her own life. I was waiting. I didn't know what for, but I knew that a lie as large and as elaborate as our marriage could not stand forever. Eventually, the foundation had to crack. The dinner party was an annual tradition, a command performance for the city's financial and cultural elite. It was the one night a year our townhouse was transformed into a public stage, and Julian was the star of the show. This year was particularly important. Julian was being courted by a massive international luxury conglomerate, the Sovereign Group, who wanted to expand the Aura brand globally, restaurants in London, Dubai, Tokyo. Deal would make him not just a chef, but a global icon. The guest of honor tonight was Alistair Finch, the notoriously ruthless CEO of the Sovereign Group, a man whose approval could turn chefs into kings. The pressure on Julian was immense, and he, in turn, transferred that pressure onto me with a casual, crushing weight. For weeks, he was a tyrant, obsessing over every detail of the evening. The flowers, the lighting, the wine pairings, and of course, the menu. This menu had to be a symphony, a masterpiece that would convince Finch of his genius. And so, for the first time in years, he needed me again, desperately. He would come to me at night, after service, with small, experimental plates, his arrogance. Temporarily shelved, replaced by the nervous energy of the young cook I remembered. "What do you think, Elena?" he would ask, his eyes searching my face for the verdict. "Is the acidity right on the scallop crudo? Does the venison need more juniper?" And I, the good, supportive wife, would taste. I would close my eyes, let the flavors unfold on my tongue, and I would give him the answer. A little more lime zest, a touch of smoked salt, a whisper of allspice in the sauce. I was once again the ghostwriter, providing the key phrases and elegant turns of phrase for his culinary poem. He took my notes without thanks, without acknowledgement, and the next day, he would present the perfected dishes to his team as his own solitary creations. The night of the party, our house was a glittering jewel box filled with a low hum of power and money. I moved through the rooms with a practiced, serene grace, my smile a perfect empty mask. I was the perfect hostess, ensuring every glass was full, every guest was charmed. I watched Julian hold court, his laughter a little too loud, his confidence brittle with ambition. He was performing, and the audience was captivated. Dinner was a triumph. Course after exquisite course emerged from the kitchen, each one a testament to his genius. I watched Alistair Finch eat, his expression unreadable. With every dish, I saw Julian glance at me from across the long, candlelit table. A quick, almost imperceptible flicker of his eyes, seeking my silent approval. He was a puppet, and I was the invisible puppeteer, pulling the strings of flavor from the shadows. It was during dessert, a delicate, ethereal creation of saffron poached pear with a cardamom foma recipe I had adapted from my grandmother's. Notes on a trip to India as the performance began to unravel. Finch, a man not known for effusive praise, set down his fork and looked at Julian. "Remarkable," he said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "Truly remarkable. The balance of flavors is a work of art. Tell me, Croft, what was the inspiration for this dish?" Julian, flushed with wine and success, beamed. This was his moment. "Inspiration is everywhere, Alistair," he began, his voice taking on the poetic, philosophical tone he used for television interviews. "For this dish, I was thinking of a trip I took to Rajasthan, the scent of the spice markets at dawn, the way the morning light hits the saffron fields." He was telling my story, my memory. I had taken that trip with my grandmother when I was a girl. I had described it to him in vivid detail. And he was stealing it right here in front of everyone, presenting my life as his own artistic inspiration. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for a decade, finally snapped. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I simply looked at him, and for the first time, I let the mask slip. I let him see the cold, clear contempt in my eyes. He saw it. He faltered for a fraction of a second, his eloquent narrative cut short by one sentence unexpected. Rebellion. He saw the ghost in the machine, and it unnerved him. His arrogance, fueled by alcohol and ambition, curdled into a sudden, vicious anger. He needed to reassert his dominance, to put me back in my place, to remind everyone in the room who the true artist was. He turned his full attention to me, a cruel, dismissive smile on his face. "Of course," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "My dear Elena wouldn't understand such things. Her palate is a bit more simple, more domestic." A confused, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. The guests looked from his face to mine, sensing the sudden, brutal shift in the atmosphere. "Isn't that right, darling?" He pressed on, his voice growing louder, more performative. "You're a wonderful home cook, the best pot roast in the city. But this," he said, gesturing to the delicate dessert, "this is a different language. A language of complexity, of art. You can't possibly appreciate the nuance." He was doing more than just insulting me. He was publicly discrediting me, erasing my one silent contribution, ensuring that no one would ever suspect that the simple, domestic wife had anything to do with the genius on their plates. I still said nothing. I just held his gaze, my silence a mirror reflecting his own ugliness, and it drove him over the edge. "For 20 years, he suddenly yelled, his voice a shocking, ugly tear in the elegant fabric of the evening. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "For 20 years, I have been held back by a life of quiet, boring domesticity. I have built an empire, and what have you done? You've raised children and planned dinner parties. You're just a homemaker, Elena, a relic from a life I have outgrown. I need to start my life over with someone who is my equal." The room was utterly, completely silent. The only sound was his own heavy, ragged breathing. He stood there, swaying, slightly, his face a mask of triumphant, drunken rage. He had finally done it. He had detonated a bomb in the center of our perfect life, and he was waiting for the applause. He looked at me, a cruel, victorious smirk on his face, expecting to see me shattered, humiliated, in tears, but I wasn't crying. I was looking past him towards the grand entrance of our dining room, because in the doorway, a figure had just appeared. A man who was not on the guest list. A man who was not supposed to be there, It was my brother. A man Julian had never met. A man Julian didn't even know existed. And he was not alone. Standing beside him, his famous, unforgettable face, a mask of cold, quiet fury, was the one man on earth who could destroy Julian with a single word. The most powerful, most feared food critic in the world, a man known to the culinary world only by his enigmatic pseudonym, the Arbiter. Julian followed my gaze. He turned, and he saw them. The triumphant smirk on his face froze, then collapsed. The color drained from his cheeks, replaced by a pale, sickly white. The master of the universe, the culinary god, looked at the man in his doorway, and he went pale with a terror so profound it was almost silent. He looked like a man who had just seen his own executioner walk into the room. The silence in the dining room was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket of shock and confusion. All eyes were on the two men standing in the doorway. My brother Daniel was a tall, quiet man with the steady, watchful eyes of the investigative journalist he was. But it was the man beside him who held the room captive. The Arbiter was a legend, a phantom. No one knew his real name. He never appeared on television. His photograph was not in any magazine. He was a critic of the old school, a man whose influence was so immense that a single scathing review from him could close a Michelin-starred restaurant overnight. His anonymity was his greatest weapon. And here he was, in the flesh, in Julian's dining room. On the night of Julian's greatest triumph and most profound cruelty, Julian stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, the drunken arrogance completely gone, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a man facing his God and knowing that judgment was at hand. "Julian Croft," the Arbiter said, his voice calm and quiet. Yet it carried across the silent room with an unnerving authority. I do apologize for the intrusion. I was not on the guest list. But I believe you have something of mine, Alistair. Finch, the CEO, was the first to recover. My God, he breathed, his eyes wide. It's him. The arbiter's gaze swept across the room, past the stunned faces of the city's elite, and settled on me. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of solidarity. I believe, he continued, his eyes now locking, onto Julian's, that you have been serving my family's recipes to your guests tonight. A collective gasp went through the room. Julian looked like he had been physically struck. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his voice a weak, pathetic version of its usual confident baritone. Don't you? The arbiter said, taking a slow step into the room. Daniel followed, his expression grim. Let's start with the dessert, the saffron poached pear with cardamom foam. A beautiful dish. My great-aunt taught it to my sister when they traveled through India together as young women. She was very specific about the use of a single hand-crushed star anise. Pod, I noticed your version had it. A lovely, authentic touch. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. My sister, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, was a woman of extraordinary talent. A woman with a palate so refined, so intuitive, she could taste not just ingredients, but memories. A woman who kept a detailed, leather-bound book of every recipe she ever perfected, a book she inherited from her grandmother. He looked directly at me. Her name was Elena, just like yours. And then he looked at my brother. And my name, he said, his voice now a blade of ice, is Daniel Russo. And Elena was not just my sister. She was your wife. The final, devastating truth landed in the room with the force of a physical explosion. My brother Daniel, the quiet, unassuming journalist, was the arbiter. The most powerful food critic in the world was my brother, the man who had been my secret ally, my silent co-conspirator for the past 6 months. The story I had told Julian, the story I had told the world, was that my family was gone, that I was an orphan with no one but him. It was the first lie I'd ever told him, a live omission. My parents had passed away, but I had a brother, a fiercely protective older brother who had been working as a foreign correspondent for years. When I had decided to marry Julian, I had kept my brother a secret. I knew that Julian, with his obsession with status and connections, would try to use my brother's fame to leverage his influence. I wanted our marriage to be ours, not a business opportunity for him. It was a decision that had cost me years of silent suffering, but it was a decision that was about to save me. 6 months ago, after Julian had published his cookbook, the one that had stolen my life's work, I had finally broken my silence. I had called Daniel. I had told him everything. The stolen recipes, the erased history, the slow, soul-crushing suffocation of my marriage, and my brother, the quiet, powerful man, who had always been my protector, had begun to plot. He didn't want a messy, public divorce for me. He wanted justice. He wanted to give Julian enough rope to hang himself. He had used his influence to get Alistair Finch to this dinner, knowing that Julian, in his desperation to impress, would overplay his hand. He had set the stage, and Julian had walked right into the trap. You see, Julian, Daniel said, his voice now filled with a cold, righteous fury, my sister is a genius, a true once-in-a-generation culinary artist. But she is also quiet and trusting, and for 20 years, you have exploited that. You have taken her gift, her art, her family's legacy, and you have sold it as your own. You have built your entire empire on the foundation of her stolen work. He walked over to the table and picked up a copy of Julian's cookbook, which had been strategically placed as a party favor for the guests. He held it up. This book, he said, is a work of fiction, not because of the stories you tell, but because of the author's name on the cover. He looked at Alistair Finch. Alistair, he said, you are a man who values authenticity above all else. You are about to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a fraud. A man who would steal his own wife's soul for profit. Is that the kind of visionary you want as the face of your global brand? Finch stared at Julian, his face a mask of stone-cold fury. He had been played. He had almost been made a fool of. And there was nothing Alistair Finch hated more than being made a fool of. Julian was a ghost, a hollowed-out man in a designer suit. He looked from Daniel's face to Finch's and then finally to mine. He saw not the quiet domestic homemaker he had just humiliated, but the architect of his complete and utter ruin. He saw a woman who had been playing a different game entirely, a long, patient game of chess, while he had been playing checkers. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He simply made a small, wounded sound, turned, and stumbled out of the room. A king dethroned in his own castle. The implosion of Julian Croft's world was swift and spectacular. The story of what happened at the dinner party spread through the city like wildfire, a delicious, scandalous tale of hubris and comeuppance. Alistair Finch, publicly and humiliatingly, pulled out of the global expansion deal the very next morning, issuing a terse statement about a fundamental lack of integrity in the Aura brand's leadership. The statement didn't name me, but it didn't have to. The whispers did the rest. Julian's empire, built on the unstable foundation of his own charisma, crumbled. His investors, spooked by the scandal and the loss of the sovereign deal, began to pull out. His top chefs and staff, men and women who had worked with me in the early days and had always known, on some level, where the real genius lay, resigned en masse. His restaurants, once impossible to get into, were suddenly half empty. The magic was gone. The lone genius had been revealed as a mere performer, and the audience had left the theater. He tried to fight back. He went on a desperate, pathetic media tour trying to paint me as a vengeful, unstable woman, a liar who was trying to steal his success. But he was trying to fight a fire with gasoline. My brother, in a single devastating move, published an article. It wasn't a scathing review. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking tribute to our grandmother, to our mother, and to me. He told the story of our family through its recipes, publishing pages from my grandmother's original, handwritten book, alongside photographs of the dishes as they were served in Julian's restaurants. The evidence was irrefutable, and it was poetic. He didn't just expose Julian as a thief. He exposed him as a man with no story of his own. The divorce was quiet and uncontested. Julian was a broken man. He had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his future. I didn't ask for a penny of his money. I didn't need to. I took only one thing, my grandmother's recipe book. I stayed in the townhouse for a few months, overseeing the sale of our shared assets. The house, once a symbol of my gilded cage, was now just a property, a collection of rooms I no longer had any emotional attachment to. I sold it, and with my half of the proceeds, I bought a small, beautiful building in the West Village dot. It had a cozy apartment upstairs and a street level, space that had once been a small bakery. It was perfect. For 6 months, I worked. I didn't work on a grand, ambitious plan to build a new empire. I worked with my hands. I sanded floors, I painted walls, I haunted flea markets for the perfect mismatched tables and chairs. I was building something small, something real, something that was entirely, completely mine. I called it Elena's Table. It wasn't a temple of gastronomy like Aura. It was a restaurant, but it was also a story. It was a small, intimate space that felt like a home. The menu was simple, a rotating selection of dishes from my grandmother's book. The food was not about complex techniques or exotic ingredients. It was about memory, about comfort, about love. It was the food of my childhood, the food of my heart. My brother, Daniel, wrote the first review. He didn't use his famous pseudonym. He wrote it under his own name. It was not a critique. It was a love letter to our family, to our history, and to the quiet, resilient woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows and claimed her own story. The restaurant was an instant, runaway success. People didn't just come for the food. They came for the story. They came for the authenticity that Julian had tried so hard to imitate, but had never truly understood. One evening, about a year after the infamous dinner party, I was in the kitchen, tasting a sauce, my hands dusted with flour, the air filled with the scent of roasting garlic and fresh herbs. I was happy. A deep, quiet, and profound happiness I hadn't felt in 20 years. My hostess came into the kitchen, her face a little pale. "Elena," she said quietly, there's someone here to see you. He doesn't have a reservation." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out into the dining room. And there he was, Julian. He was standing awkwardly by the door, looking thin and lost. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple, worn jacket. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out weariness. He looked at me, at the bustling, happy restaurant I had built, at the life I had created from the ashes of the one he had destroyed. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the food. Everyone is talking about it. I wanted to taste it for myself." I looked at the man who had been my husband, my partner, my tormentor, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, final sense of closure. "I'm sorry, Julian," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "We're fully booked." I turned and walked back into my kitchen, back to the beautiful, noisy, wonderful life I had built. The life that was finally completely my own. The years that followed were a quiet, steady blossoming. Elena's table became more than a restaurant. It was an institution. It never expanded, never franchised. It remained a small, perfect jewel box of a place, a testament to the power of authentic, heartfelt cooking. I won awards, I received accolades, but the praise that mattered most came from the quiet, satisfied smiles of the people who filled my dining room every night. I found love again, a different kind of love. Not the fiery, ambitious passion I had shared with Julian, but a quiet, steady partnership with a kind, gentle man, a university professor who loved my stories more than my food. We built a life together, a real one, based on honesty and mutual respect that my children, who had been caught in the crossfire of their parents' war, healed. They saw their father's downfall, but they also saw their mother's quiet, powerful rise. They spent their time between his new, modest life and my warm, bustling one. They learned a difficult but valuable lesson about the difference between a life that looks perfect on the outside and one that is truly, authentically happy. One day, a letter arrived at the restaurant. It was from Julian. It was not an apology. Not really. He was not a man capable of true remorse. But it was a confession. He wrote that he had finally understood what he had lost. It wasn't just the money or the fame. It was the source, he called it. He had spent years trying to replicate the magic of the food we had created together, but he couldn't. The genius, he finally admitted, had never been his. It had been mine. It had been my grandmother's. It had been the love and the history he had tried so hard to erase. It was a sad, pathetic letter, the final, dying echo of a man who had built his life on a lie and was now left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own empty success. I folded the letter and put it away. It was the final page in a long, painful chapter of my life, a chapter that was now finally closed. That evening, as I stood in my kitchen, the heart of my small, happy empire, I looked around at the life I had built. The scent of fresh bread, the sound of laughter from the dining room, the steady, comforting presence of my new husband chopping vegetables beside me. I thought of the woman who had stood in a glittering penthouse, a silent, invisible ghost at her own anniversary party. I thought of her pain, her humiliation, her quiet, simmering rage. And I sent a silent thank you to the man who had inflicted that pain upon me. His cruelty had been a gift. His final brutal insult had been the key that had unlocked my own cage. He had tried to declare me a homemaker, a relic, a thing to be discarded. But in doing so, he had forced me to remember the woman I was before him, the woman I was always meant to be, the artist, the creator, the true source of the magic. He had meant to start his life over, but instead, he had given me back my own. And it was a life that was more beautiful, more delicious, and more real than anything he could have ever imagined.